He thought he was just hiring a new maid. He had no idea that when he opened his door, he was letting in a ghost he had buried 30 years ago. He thought the past was dead. He was wrong. The past was just waiting for the right moment to come home. When their eyes met, something in Elias's chest tightened. It was a cold, strange pull, like a song you haven't heard in decades, but the melody makes your skin crawl. He didn't know it yet. He couldn't have known. But the young woman standing on his porch was the daughter he had abandoned before she took her first breath. The child he never looked for. The child he hoped didn't exist. Elias Thorne lived in a world of perfect order. At 61, he was a man of iron habits. He was tall, silver-haired, and had eyes that moved like a hunter's. He had built Thorne Heights construction from nothing. In this city, his name meant power. In this house, his word was law. He lived alone in a massive villa. He liked the silence. Silence doesn't judge you. But that morning, the silence was broken. There was a soft knock on his office door. It was Grace, his housekeeper of 5 years. She was a loyal woman, kind woman, but today she looked pale. "Sir," she said softly, "I have to leave." The words hit the floor like lead. Elias didn't move. "Leave? Is it the salary, Grace? Is there a problem?" Grace shook her head. For the first time, she looked proud. "No, sir. I saved my money. I've enrolled in school. I want to be a nurse. I want to do something meaningful." Elias was a hard man, but he wasn't a cruel one. He nodded slowly. "I understand. I am proud of you, Grace. But this house is too big for me to manage alone." Grace smiled. She had been waiting for this. "I've already found a replacement, sir. A girl from my old neighborhood. She is calm. She is hardworking. She is a serious person. I trust her with my life." Elias narrowed his eyes. He didn't like strangers, but he trusted Grace. "Fine," he said. "Bring her tomorrow. If you trust her, I'll give her a chance." He went back to his desk. He thought it was just a small change, a minor detail in his busy life. But deep in his chest, something was humming. A low, vibrating warning, like the air before a lightning strike. The world was holding its breath. Across town, in a cramped fourth-floor apartment, a girl named Mary was brushing her hair. The apartment was old. The elevator stayed broken. The walls were thin, but Mary kept it spotless. In the corner of her room sat a single wooden shelf. On it was a Bible and a photo of her mother, Clara. In the photo, Clara was 20. She was laughing. She looked like a woman who didn't know how much the world was about to hurt her. Mary looked at that photo every single morning. She didn't say a word. She just touched the frame. Her mother had raised her alone. One pair of hands to braid her hair. One voice to sing her to sleep. Clara had worked as a seamstress until her fingers bled. They were poor, but Mary never felt it. She felt loved. But there was always the empty space. When Mary was 6, she drew a picture of a family. She drew her mother. She drew herself. Then, she left a blank spot on the left side of the paper. "Where is Daddy?" she had asked. Clara had gone very still. Her needle stopped moving. "His name was Simon," she said. Her voice was a whisper. "He knew about you, Mary. He chose to leave." Mary grew up with that answer. It stayed in her bones. When she was 16, the world fell apart. Her mother got sick. It was fast. It was brutal. Mary sat by the hospital bed and watched the only person who loved her fade away. Now, 10 years later, Mary was standing in front of a massive white villa. She pressed the bell. The gate groaned open. She walked past the perfect red flowers. She walked past the grass that was trimmed like a golf course. "Someone is very particular here," she thought. Grace met her at the door and led her inside. The house smelled like expensive wax and old money. Grace told her to wait on a bench in the hallway. Then, she heard footsteps. Heavy, steady, unhurried. Elias Thorne walked around the corner. He was wearing a crisp white shirt. He looked like a man who had never made a mistake in his life. He looked at Mary. He didn't gasp. He didn't trip. But he stopped. For a split second, his mask slipped. His eyes searched her face like he was looking for a ghost. He saw his own jawline. He saw Clara's eyes. He blinked. The mask went back on. "Good morning," he said. His voice was cold, but it lacked its usual edge. "You must be Mary." "Yes, sir," she said. They stood in the hallway, two strangers tied together by 30 years of secrets. Neither of them spoke the truth. The handle of the door had been touched, but the door was still closed. The silence in the Thorne villa wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy. It sat in the corners of the rooms like dust that Mary refused to let settle. Mary moved through the house like a breeze. She was efficient, quiet, and invisible. Exactly what Elias thought he wanted. But every time she entered a room, the air seemed to thin. Elias sat in his study, surrounded by leather-bound books he'd already read and blueprints for buildings that hadn't been built yet. He tried to focus on the Westside Plaza project, but his eyes kept drifting to the doorway. He heard the soft thump-thump of the vacuum. He heard the clink of porcelain in the kitchen. "It's just a face," he muttered to himself, gripping his gold fountain pen. Coincidence. Genetics playing a cruel trick. But then he saw it. Mary was dusting the mantel. She reached up to move a small, silver clock, an antique he'd owned for decades. As she tilted her head to check the alignment, the sunlight hit her profile. Elias froze. The pen snapped in his hand. It wasn't just the jawline. It was the way she tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear with her pinky finger extended. Exactly like Clara. "Mary!" he barked. She jumped, nearly dropping the clock. She turned, her eyes wide but steady. "Yes, Mr. Thorne? Did I disturb you?" "No," he said, his voice gravelly. He stared at her hand. Where are you from, Mary?" Grace mentioned the old neighborhood. "But where were you born?" Mary set the clock down. She didn't look away. "The East Side, sir. Near the old docks. My mother and I moved there before I can remember." "And your father?" The question felt like a confession. Mary's expression didn't change, but her voice grew cold. "I never knew him. My mother said he was a man who preferred his shadows to the light. He gave her a choice, and he chose himself." Elias felt a phantom pain in his chest. He waved a hand dismissively. "That will be all. Get the guest room ready. My associate, Benjamin, is arriving this evening for dinner." Benjamin arrived at 7 p.m. sharp. Benjamin was 40, sharp-featured, and wore suits that cost more than Mary's annual salary. He was Elias's protege, the man groomed to take over Thorne Heights. But Benjamin didn't have Elias's soul. He only had his greed. They sat at the long mahogany table. Mary moved between them, serving a crown roast with practiced grace. "The new help is quite striking, Elias," Benjamin remarked, watching Mary as she poured the wine. His eyes trailed her with a predatory curiosity. "Where did you find her?" "Grace's recommendation," Elias said shortly. He didn't like the way Benjamin looked at her. It felt like someone touching his private property. "She has a familiar look," Benjamin continued, leaning back. "Something about the eyes. Reminds me of that old portrait in your private gallery. The one you keep locked." Elias dropped his fork. The clatter echoed through the dining room. "Eat your dinner, Benjamin. We have the zoning permits to discuss." Mary stood by the sideboard, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew that name, Benjamin. Her mother's old journals, the ones hidden under the floorboards of their apartment, had mentioned a Benny, a man who had done the dirty work for the great Simon Thorne. She wasn't just here for a job. She was here for the ledger. Late that night, when the house was draped in moonlight and the only sound was the humming of the refrigerator, Mary crept toward the study. She knew Elias was a man of patterns. He took his heart medication at 10 p.m. and fell into a heavy, medicinal sleep by 10:30. She used a thin wire, a trick she'd learned from a neighbor years ago, to click the lock on his desk. Her hands shook. She pulled open the bottom drawer. Behind a false back, she found it. The thick, black leather book. The private ledger of Thorne Heights. She flipped through the pages. Names, dates, payments, October 1996. Clara M. Severance agreement. $5,000. Conditions: non-disclosure, relocation, termination of parental rights. Below it was a signature. A bold, arrogant E. Mary felt a hot tear track down her cheek. $5,000. That was the price of her life. That was what her mother's silence had cost. Looking for something, Mary? The voice came from the shadows by the window. Mary gasped, slamming the drawer shut, but the ledger was still on top of the desk. Elias stepped into the moonlight. He wasn't in his pajamas. He was still in his suit, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "I wondered how long it would take you to find it," he whispered. "You have your mother's curiosity. And her fire." Mary stood tall, clutching the desk for support. "You bought her. You bought me before I was even born." "I protected my empire," Elias said, though he sounded like he was trying to convince himself. "I gave her a way out. You gave her a grave." Mary shouted, her voice cracking the silence of the villa. "She died working 3 jobs while you sat in this museum of a house." Elias took a step forward, his hand reaching out, then stopping midair. "Mary, I didn't know she died. Because you never looked." The air in the study felt like it was ionizing, the kind of stillness that happens right before a structure collapses. Elias looked at the ledger, then at Mary, and for the first time in 30 years, the king of Thorne Heights looked small. Elias took a step toward the desk, his hand trembling as it hovered over the black leather book. I thought the money would give her a life. Clean start. I didn't want the scandal to break the company, Mary. I was young. I was terrified of losing everything I'd built." "You weren't terrified of losing us." Mary spat, her voice a jagged blade. She grabbed the ledger, clutching it to her chest like a shield. "You didn't want a clean start for her. You wanted a clean conscience for yourself. You paid $5,000 to delete a human being." Elias slumped into his leather chair, the moonlight carving deep hollows into his face. "I sent more. After the first year, I sent a second check to the address Benjamin gave me. It came back recipient unknown. I assumed she had moved on, that she wanted nothing to do with me." Mary froze. "Benjamin gave you the address?" "He handled the logistics," Elias whispered. "He was my fixer. Even back then, he knew how to make problems disappear." The realization hit Mary like a physical blow. Her mother had never seen a second check. Her mother had died in a basement apartment with a broken heater while Elias Thorne's fixer was likely lining his own pockets with the hush money. "A touching family reunion," a voice drawled from the doorway. Benjamin stood there, leaning against the frame. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket anymore. His sleeves were rolled up, and he was holding a glass of Elias's most expensive scotch. He looked bored, but his eyes were dancing with a cruel light. "How long have you been standing there, Ben?" Elias asked, his voice regaining a sliver of its old authority. "Long enough to realize my retirement plan just got a lot more complicated," Benjamin said, stepping into the room. He pointed the glass at Mary. "I knew I recognized that fire. You look just like Clara did the night I told her she had 24 hours to pack her bags and leave the city." Mary's vision blurred with rage. You were the one who threatened her." "I was the one who did what was necessary, sweetheart," Benjamin countered. He turned to Elias. "The board is already nervous about the West Side project, Elias. If word gets out that the great moral pillar of this city abandoned a pregnant girl and then hired her as a maid 30 years later, well, the stock will plummet. Thorne Heights will be a crater." Benjamin took a slow sip of his drink. "But it doesn't have to be that way. I can make this go away. Again. For a price." "What price?" Elias asked, his jaw tightening. "Total control," Benjamin smiled. "Sign the CEO transition papers tonight. Give me the chair, and I'll ensure Mary here gets a very generous inheritance to disappear quietly. If not," he pulled out his phone. "I have a journalist on speed dial who loves a good sins of the father story." The room went silent. Elias looked at the papers on his desk. the power he had spent his entire life protecting. Then he looked at Mary. He saw the tears in her eyes, but he also saw the iron in her posture. She wasn't begging. She was waiting to see if he was still the coward who had signed that ledger in 1996. Elias stood up. He walked over to the desk, picked up his gold fountain pen, and uncapped it. "Don't do it," Mary whispered. Elias looked at her. "He's right, Mary. If this breaks, everything I built is gone. You'll have nothing. I'll have nothing. I've had nothing my whole life," Mary yelled. "I don't want your money, and I don't want your company. I want you to be a man for once. Stand up to him." Benjamin laughed. "Listen to the help, Elias. She's idealistic. But you and I? We're businessmen. Sign the paper." Elias looked down at the transition document. He pressed the pen to the signature line. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, he dragged the pen across the page, ripping the paper in half. He turned to Benjamin, his eyes blazing with a fire that hadn't been there for decades. "The board won't listen to a blackmailer, Benjamin," Elias said, his voice booming. "Because tomorrow morning, I'm calling a press conference. I'm going to tell them everything. The girl, the ledger, and the fixer who stole the money meant for her mother." Benjamin's smile vanished. "You'll ruin yourself." "No," Elias said, looking at Mary. "I'm finally paying the debt. The war is out in the open. Benjamin is cornered and dangerous, and Elias has finally chosen his daughter over his empire." Benjamin didn't leave. He didn't scream. He simply set his glass down on the mahogany table with a click that sounded like a hammer cocking on a pistol. "You've grown soft in your old age, Elias," Benjamin said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous silk. "You think a confession makes you a hero? It just makes you a target." Benjamin reached into his inner suit pocket. He didn't pull out a phone this time. He pulled out a small, leather-bound folder. "You aren't the only one who keeps a ledger, Elias. I have the records of every building permit we fast-tracked, every inspector we put on the payroll, and every corner we cut on the West Side project. If you go down, I'm not just going to watch. I'm going to push you." He looked at Mary, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "And as for the girl? Accidents happen in construction zones all the time. Scaffolding falls. Brakes fail. It's a dangerous world for a maid who knows too much." The threat hung in the air, cold and heavy. Elias felt a surge of adrenaline he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't the CEO right now. He was the man who had built this empire with his bare hands. "Get out," Elias said. "Make me," Benjamin challenged. Elias didn't call the police. He didn't call security. He walked to the wall behind his desk and pressed a hidden latch. A small wall safe clicked open, but he didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a digital recorder, the kind he used for dictating memos. He pressed play. "I was the one who did what was necessary, sweetheart. I'll ensure Mary here gets a very generous inheritance to disappear quietly." Benjamin's face turned the color of ash. "I've been recording every meeting in this office for 10 years, Benjamin," Elias said, "including the last 15 minutes. I don't need to confess to the press to ruin you. I just need to send this audio to the district attorney. Blackmail, extortion, and admitting to the theft of funds. I think that'll be enough to keep you away from Mary for a very long time." The sun began to rise over the Thorne villa, turning the white stone to gold. Benjamin was gone, escorted out by the security team Elias had finally summoned. Men who knew their loyalty lay with the name on the gate, not the man in the suit. Elias and Mary stood on the terrace, looking out over the city. The silence between them was different now. It wasn't the silence of secrets. It was the quiet of a beginning. "I can't give you back the 30 years, Elias said, looking out at the skyline he had helped shape. "And I can't ask you to call me father. I haven't earned that." He handed her the black ledger. "But Thorne Heights is half yours. Legally, formally, I'm stepping down. I want to spend whatever time I have left making sure the empty space in your life is filled with something other than ghosts." Mary looked at the book, then at the man beside her. She saw the flaws, the gray hair, and the deep regret. But for the first time, She also saw the man her mother had once loved, a man capable of change. "I don't want the company, Elias," Mary said softly, tucking a lock of hair behind her ear. "But I think I'd like to stay. Not as a maid. As a Thorne." Elias smiled, a real weary smile. "Then we have a lot of work to do. We need to build something that actually lasts." 6 months later, the East Side docks weren't the same. The gray, crumbling tenements were still there, but in the center of the neighborhood sat a new construction site. It wasn't a luxury high-rise or a glass-walled office building. The sign out front read, "The Clara Thorne Center." Elias stood in the dirt, wearing a hard hat and a safety vest. He looked older, his face more lined, but the heaviness in his shoulders had vanished. He was looking at a set of blueprints, but he wasn't looking at them alone. Mary stood beside him, pointing to the layout of the 3rd floor. "The vocational wing needs more natural light, Elias. If these women are going to study and work, they shouldn't feel like they're in a basement." "You're right," Elias nodded, marking the change with a pencil. "We'll move the windows. We'll use the reinforced glass from the West Side supplier." They worked together in a comfortable rhythm. The transition hadn't been easy. The press had been brutal. The legal battles with Benjamin had been long, and the board of directors had nearly revolted. But Elias had stood his ground. He had liquidated his personal shares to fund this project, a housing and education center for single mothers. It was the first building he had ever built that didn't have his name on the cornerstone. As the sun began to set, the workers started packing up. Mary walked over to a small, young tree that had been planted near the entrance. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, framed photo, the one of her mother at 20 laughing. She tucked it into a weatherproof niche they had designed into the lobby wall. "She would have liked this," Elias said, stepping up behind her. He didn't reach out to touch her. He still gave her the space she needed, but he stood close enough to share the warmth. "She would have hated the attention," Mary laughed softly, wiping a bit of dust from the frame. "But she would have loved the library." Mary looked up at the man who was no longer a ghost or a king, but simply her father. The empty space in her drawings wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the sound of hammers, the smell of sawdust, and the presence of a man who had finally stopped running. "Come on," Mary said, handing him his jacket. "You promised to show me those old photos of the city before the towers went up." Elias took the jacket, a look of immense peace crossing his face. "I did, and I have a lot of stories to tell you, Mary. Some of them are even true." They walked toward the car together, not as employer and maid or CEO and heir, but as two people finally coming home.